The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, just as I was adjusting the final place setting on our mahogany dining table. Through the frosted glass, I could see two silhouettes instead of the one I was expecting. My husband, Marcus, had texted an hour earlier saying he was bringing a surprise guest to our intimate family dinner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Standing there in my red silk dress, carefully chosen to complement the holiday decor I'd spent weeks perfecting, I had no idea that this surprise would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage. I opened the door with a warm smile, ready to welcome whoever Marcus had decided to include in our Christmas celebration. But the smile froze on my face when I saw Amber Sullivan, his 26-year-old secretary, standing beside him in a flowing, emerald dress that couldn't quite hide the gentle curve of her belly. Her hand rested protectively over what was unmistakably a baby bump, while Marcus's arm circled her waist with an intimacy that made my stomach drop. "Victoria, darling," Marcus said, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness he used during difficult client presentations. "I hope you don't mind, but Amber had nowhere to go for Christmas, and well, we have some wonderful news to share with the family." The moment stretched between us like a held breath. Amber's eyes met mine with a mixture of defiance and guilt, while Marcus stood there as if bringing his pregnant mistress to Christmas dinner was the most natural thing in the world. Behind them, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, creating a picture-perfect holiday scene that felt like a mockery of everything I'd believed about my life. "Of course," I heard myself saying, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Please come in from the cold." As they stepped into our foyer, I caught a whiff of Amber's perfume, the same scent I'd been smelling on Marcus's shirts for months. The scent I'd convinced myself was from elevators, from clients, from anywhere except the truth that was now standing in my living room, glowing with pregnancy and wearing my husband's devotion like a second skin. My name is Victoria Hayes, and until that Christmas Eve, I thought I was living a successful life. I was 34 years old, a senior marketing director at one of Denver's most prestigious advertising firms, and married to Marcus Hayes, who ran the family marketing business his father had built from nothing. We lived in a beautiful colonial house in Cherry Hills Village, complete with the white picket fence and perfectly manicured lawn that appeared in every American dream commercial I'd ever created. For 8 years, I'd played the role of the supportive wife, attending Marcus's business dinners, hosting elegant parties for his clients, and quietly building my own career while he basked in the glory of Hayes & Associates marketing firm. I'd convinced myself that our marriage was solid, built on mutual respect and shared ambitions, even as the passion had gradually cooled into polite companionship. The signs had been there for months, but I'd become an expert at explaining them away. The late nights at the office had increased dramatically after Marcus hired Amber as his personal secretary 8 months ago. He'd started paying more attention to his appearance, buying new cologne, hitting the gym with renewed enthusiasm. When I'd mentioned these changes, he'd laughed and said he was just motivated to grow the business, to make us proud. Then there were the phone calls he'd take in other rooms, the text messages he'd shield from my view, the way he'd become distant during our conversations, as if part of him was always somewhere else. But Marcus had always been ambitious, always focused on the next big client or campaign. I'd learned to live with being secondary to his business goals, telling myself that this was the price of success. Standing in our foyer that Christmas Eve, watching Marcus help Amber out of her coat with tender care he hadn't shown me in years, I realized how thoroughly I'd been deceiving myself. This wasn't about business ambition. This was about my husband falling in love with someone else, someone young enough to be his daughter, someone who was now carrying his child. "Victoria, you remember Amber from the office parties," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying that slightly manic edge I recognized from when he was pitching to reluctant clients. "She's been such an asset to the company this year." Amber smiled nervously, her hand never leaving her belly. "Mrs. Hayes, thank you so much for including me tonight. Marcus has told me so much about your hospitality." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being thanked for my hospitality by the woman who was destroying my marriage. I managed to nod graciously, falling back on the social skills that had served me well in countless business situations. "Please, call me Victoria." And, "Congratulations," I said, my eyes deliberately moving to her obvious pregnancy. "When are you due?" Marcus and Amber exchanged a look that spoke volumes. It was the kind of intimate glance that passes between two people who share secrets, who've created something beautiful together. The kind of look Marcus and I hadn't shared in years. "June," Amber replied softly. "We wanted to wait until after the holidays to make any announcements, but Marcus thought it would be nice to share the news with family first." Family. The word hung in the air like a challenge. I wasn't family to this woman, and increasingly, it seemed like I wasn't family to my husband either. But they'd invited themselves into my home, into my carefully planned Christmas celebration, to announce their betrayal as if it were cause for celebration. The dining room I'd spent hours perfecting suddenly felt like a stage set for my own humiliation. The Christmas tree in the corner, decorated with ornaments Marcus and I had collected during 8 years of marriage, twinkled merrily. The table was set for 6, as we were expecting Marcus's mother, Helen, and his sister Diane to join us later. I'd prepared Marcus's favorite meal, prime rib with all the traditional sides, along with the homemade chocolate cake that had become our Christmas tradition. Now, looking at Amber's glowing face and Marcus's proud expression, I realized this dinner wasn't going to be the intimate family celebration I'd envisioned. It was going to be the public announcement of my replacement. "Why don't you both sit down?" I said, gesturing toward the living room. "I'll get us some drinks while we wait for the others to arrive." In the kitchen, I gripped the marble countertop and tried to steady my breathing. My reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator showed a woman who looked perfectly composed on the surface, but whose eyes betrayed the storm raging inside. I'd built my career on staying calm under pressure, on finding creative solutions to impossible problems. But this wasn't a difficult client or a challenging campaign. This was my life, my marriage, my future being casually discarded in favor of a younger model. I opened the wine cabinet and selected a bottle of the expensive Cabernet we'd been saving for a special occasion. Apparently, Marcus finding out he was going to be a father with another woman qualified as special enough. As I uncorked the wine, my mind began to work in the strategic way that had made me successful in the marketing world. This wasn't happening by accident. Marcus hadn't simply decided on a whim to bring his pregnant mistress to Christmas dinner. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was calculated, planned, designed to corner me in a situation where I couldn't make a scene without appearing unhinged in front of his family. He was counting on my professionalism, my politeness, my deep-seated need to maintain appearances. But as I poured 3 glasses of wine and 1 sparkling cider for Amber, I found myself thinking not about how to gracefully handle this situation, but about how spectacularly I could turn it to my advantage. The sound of Marcus's laughter drifted from the living room, followed by Amber's delighted giggle. They sounded like teenagers in love, giddy with their secret that was no longer secret. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed I would be the passive victim in their story, the discarded wife who would quietly step aside to make room for their happiness. They had no idea that Victoria Hayes, the woman who'd won 3 national advertising awards in the past 2 years, who'd built million-dollar campaigns from nothing but creativity and determination, wasn't planning to go down without a fight. As I arranged the drinks on a silver tray, I caught sight of the stack of mail I'd left on the kitchen counter earlier that day. On top was an envelope from Morrison, Chen & Associates, the law firm I'd been consulting with for the past month. Not about divorce, as it turned out, but about something far more interesting and potentially devastating to Marcus's carefully constructed world. You see, while Marcus had been busy falling in love with his secretary and planning his new family, I'd been conducting my own investigation into Hayes & Associates' marketing firm, and what I'd discovered was going to make this Christmas dinner far more memorable than either of them had anticipated. 3 months ago, I'd started noticing discrepancies in the work Marcus was presenting to clients. Campaigns that bore striking similarities to projects I'd developed at my own firm. Strategies that seemed remarkably familiar. Creative concepts that I could have sworn I'd seen before. At first, I'd dismissed it as coincidence. The marketing world was smaller than people realized, and similar ideas often emerged independently. But then I'd recognized an entire campaign pitch that Marcus presented to Denver's largest retail chain. Not just similar to work I'd done, but identical in every significant detail. The tagline, the visual concept, the market positioning strategy. It was a campaign I'd developed 6 months earlier for a client in Phoenix, a campaign that had never been publicly released due to budget constraints. That's when I'd started paying closer attention to Marcus's work, and what I'd found had been both enlightening and infuriating. For over a year, my husband had been systematically stealing my ideas, my strategies, my creative concepts, and presenting them as his own. Work. He'd been accessing my laptop when I worked from home, photographing my notebooks, even recording our casual conversations about marketing challenges I was facing. The revelation had explained so much about Hayes & Associates' sudden surge in success over the past year. Marcus had been taking credit for my innovations while I'd been none the wiser, attributing his company's growth to his business acumen rather than intellectual theft. I'd spent the last month working with Patricia Romano, one of Denver's most aggressive intellectual property attorneys, building a case that would not only expose Marcus's theft, but potentially destroy his business. We had evidence, documentation, timestamps, everything needed to prove that Marcus Hayes had built his recent success on stolen ideas. But tonight, as I prepared to serve drinks to my husband and his pregnant mistress, I realized that intellectual property theft was going to be the least of Marcus's problems. Returning to the living room with the tray, I found them sitting close together on the sofa, Amber's head resting on Marcus's shoulder while he rubbed her belly with obvious affection. The sight should have broken my heart, but instead, it filled me with a cold, calculating fury that sharpened my focus like nothing ever had. "Here we are," I said brightly, distributing the drinks. "A toast to new beginnings." Marcus raised his glass with obvious relief, probably thinking I was taking the news better than he'd expected. Amber smiled gratefully, clearly nervous about how this evening was going to unfold. "To new beginnings," Marcus echoed, and we all sipped our drinks while I smiled and planned his destruction. The doorbell rang again, signaling the arrival of Marcus's family. As I went to answer it, I caught my reflection once more in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same perfectly styled hair, the same elegant red dress, the same composed expression. But something fundamental had changed in her eyes. There was steel there now, determination that hadn't existed an hour ago. Helen Hayes entered first, a regal woman in her 70s, who'd never quite approved of her son's choice to marry someone who worked outside the family business. Behind her came Diane Hayes Cooper, Marcus's younger sister who'd always treated me with polite condescension, and her husband Robert, a quiet man who seemed perpetually uncomfortable at family gatherings. "Victoria, darling," Helen said, offering her cheek for the obligatory kiss. "Something smells wonderful. You've outdone yourself again." "Thank you, Helen. Marcus has a surprise guest tonight," I said, guiding them toward the living room where the happy couple waited. The reactions were everything I could have hoped for. Helen's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally, a carefully controlled blankness that I recognized as her way of processing. Unexpected information? Diane's mouth actually fell open before she caught herself. while Robert simply stared as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Mother, Diane, Robert," Marcus said, standing with Amber beside him, his arm protectively around her waist. "I'd like you to meet Amber Sullivan. She works with me at the firm, and well, we have some exciting news to share." The silence that followed was deafening. I found myself studying each family member's reaction with the same analytical eye I used when testing campaign concepts with focus groups. Helen's slight intake of breath, Diane's sideways glance at me, Robert's obvious discomfort, all of it. Data points in the drama that was about to unfold. "Amber and I," Marcus continued, his voice gaining confidence as he misread the silence for anticipation rather than shock, "are having a baby. We wanted you all to be the first to know." The announcement hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. I watched Helen's face cycle through several emotions before settling on an expression of forced politeness that would have been impressive if it weren't so transparent. "How wonderful," Helen finally managed, her voice carrying about as much warmth as a Denver winter morning. "And when did this happen?" It was Diane who asked the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. "Marcus, what about Victoria?" All eyes turned to me, and I realized this was my moment to set the tone for everything that would follow. I could play the shocked, betrayed wife, the victim of my husband's infidelity. I could create a scene, demand explanations, break down in tears. Instead, I smiled with genuine warmth and raised my wine glass. "Actually," I said, my voice clear and confident, "I have some news of my own to share tonight. Some papers that I think will make this Christmas truly unforgettable." Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment, a flash of uncertainty crossing his features. But he recovered quickly, probably assuming I was going to announce my gracious acceptance of the situation, maybe even my intention to seek a quiet divorce. He had no idea that the papers I was referring to weren't divorce documents, though. Those were certainly coming. The papers waiting in my briefcase upstairs were something far more devastating, something that would ensure this Christmas dinner became the beginning of Marcus Hayes's complete and total downfall. As I looked around the room at their expectant faces, I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced in months. For too long, I'd been the supporting player in Marcus's story, the wife who made his success possible while remaining invisible, herself. Tonight, that was going to change. Tonight, Victoria Hayes was going to become the protagonist of her own story, and Marcus was going to discover that underestimating his wife had been the biggest mistake of his life. The first act of my revenge was about to begin, and I intended to make it memorable. The dining room felt charged with electricity as we all took our seats around the mahogany table I'd polished to perfection that morning. Marcus had positioned himself at the head of the table, with Amber to his right, in what had traditionally been my seat during family dinners. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all Helen, whose lips had formed a thin line of disapproval that she was trying unsuccessfully to disguise. I found myself sitting across from Amber, studying her with the same intensity I'd once reserved for analyzing competitor campaigns. She was undeniably beautiful in that fresh, uncomplicated way that came with youth. Her blonde hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her skin had that luminous quality that pregnancy brought to some women. But it was her eyes that interested me most, nervous, darting glances between Marcus and me, as if she couldn't quite believe she was actually here, in my home, at my table, carrying my husband's child. "Victoria, this roast looks absolutely divine," Helen said, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. "You always were gifted in the kitchen." It was a backhanded compliment typical of my mother-in-law, suggesting that cooking was perhaps my greatest achievement. For years, I'd accepted these subtle dismissals, focusing instead on building my career while maintaining perfect domestic appearances. Tonight, however, Helen's condescension felt almost amusing rather than irritating. Thank you, Helen. I've been experimenting with new techniques I learned from Caroline West, my colleague who trained at Le Cordon Bleu. I carved the meat with precise, elegant movements, making sure everyone could see my steady hands. She's been teaching me that the key to any successful presentation is timing and preparation. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps sensing an undercurrent he couldn't quite identify. Amber, meanwhile, was pushing food around her plate, clearly too nervous to eat despite the supposed celebration of their happy news. Speaking of colleagues, Diane interjected, her voice carrying that sharp edge she'd inherited from her mother. Amber, how long have you been working at Hayes & Associates? 8 months, Amber replied quietly, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. I started right after graduating from Colorado State. 8 months, I repeated thoughtfully, as if doing mental calculations. And you're due in June. How perfectly timed. The comment hung in the air like a sword waiting to drop. Marcus's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure. He'd always prided himself on being in control of every situation, the master manipulator who could charm his way out of any difficulty. But tonight, sitting at his own dining room table with his pregnant mistress beside him and his wife across from them, even Marcus seemed to realize he'd painted himself into a corner. Victoria, he began, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. I know this is unexpected, but I hope we can handle this like mature adults. Amber and I never meant for things to happen this way. Oh, I'm sure you didn't, I replied, taking a sip of my wine. After all, workplace relationships can be so complicated. All those late nights at the office, those weekend strategy sessions, those business trips that seem to require personal assistance. It must have been quite the challenge, maintaining professional boundaries. Amber flushed red, clearly understanding that I knew far more about their relationship than they'd assumed. Marcus, however, seemed to interpret my calm tone as acceptance, or perhaps resignation. The thing is, he continued, emboldened by what he mistook for my compliance, Amber and I have decided to make this official. We're planning to get married as soon as possible, considering the baby and all. Helen's fork clattered against her plate, while Diane made a small sound of distress. Even Robert, who usually remained silent during family dramas, looked up, with obvious shock. Married, I repeated slowly, as if testing the word. How romantic. A Christmas engagement announcement along with the pregnancy reveal. Very efficient, Marcus. You always did like to handle multiple objectives with a single action. Victoria, please, Marcus said, his patience beginning to fray. I know this is difficult, but we need to discuss practical matters. The divorce, the house, the business arrangements. We can work something out that's fair to everyone. Fair to everyone. The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. Fair would have been Marcus discussing his feelings before starting an affair. Fair would have been honesty about his relationship with Amber before she became pregnant. Fair would have been not building his business success on ideas stolen from my work. Of course we need to discuss practical matters, I agreed, setting down my wine glass with deliberate precision. In fact, I've been giving those matters considerable thought over the past few weeks. I excused myself from the table, ignoring the confused glances exchanged between the family members. Upstairs in my home office, I retrieved the leather briefcase I'd prepared earlier that afternoon. Inside were documents that would transform this awkward family dinner into something far more consequential. When I returned to the dining room, I found them all sitting in tense silence. Amber looked like she might cry, while Marcus was clearly struggling to maintain his facade of confident control. Helen and Diane were whispering urgently to each other, probably trying to figure out how to salvage the family's reputation from this disaster. Before we discuss divorce arrangements, I said, resuming my seat and placing the briefcase beside my chair, I think there are some other practical matters we should address first. I opened the briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder, setting it on the table with the same care I might use when presenting a campaign proposal to a particularly important client. Marcus, do you remember the Westfield Shopping Center campaign you presented last month? The one that won Hayes and Associates that massive contract with Regional Retail Group? Marcus frowned, clearly confused by the sudden change of subject. Of course I remember. It was one of our biggest successes this year. Why? What about the Mountain Vista Resort campaign from September? The integrated marketing strategy that landed you the entire Colorado Tourism Board account? Victoria, what does this have to do with anything? Marcus's voice carried a note of irritation now. We're trying to discuss our personal situation here. Oh, but this is very personal, I replied, opening the folder and withdrawing a stack of documents. Because both of those campaigns, along with 6 others that Hayes and Associates presented as original work this year, were actually developed by me at Morrison & Lang Marketing. The color drained from Marcus's face so rapidly that for a moment I thought he might faint. Amber looked confused, clearly not understanding the significance of what I'd just revealed. But Helen and Diane were sharp enough to grasp the implications immediately. "What are you saying?" Diane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that Marcus has been stealing my work for over a year." I began laying out documents systematically, like evidence in a courtroom. Here's the original proposal I developed for Westfield Shopping Center 6 months before Marcus presented his original concept. Here are my preliminary sketches for the Mountain Vista campaign, complete with timestamps from my computer files. Marcus was staring at the papers as if they might spontaneously combust. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The confident businessman who'd walked into this dinner with his pregnant mistress and his grand announcements had been replaced by a man who looked like he was watching his entire world collapse. "You've been photographing my work," I continued, my voice steady and professional. "Copying files from my laptop when I worked from home. Recording our conversations when I'd discuss challenging projects I was developing. Then presenting those ideas as your own innovations to build Hayes and Associates' reputation." "That's impossible," Helen said firmly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Marcus would never—" "Would never what? Steal? Lie? Cheat?" I looked directly at her, then shifted my gaze to encompass the entire table. "Because he's certainly demonstrated a willingness to do all 3, hasn't he?" Amber finally found her voice. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" It was fascinating to watch the exact moment when Marcus realized that his carefully constructed house of cards was tumbling down. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely defeated. "Victoria, please," he said quietly. "We can work this out. I'll make sure you get proper credit going forward. We can restructure the business arrangements." "You'll make sure I get proper credit?" I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "Marcus, you've been building your entire recent success on my stolen work. The Regional Retail Group contract alone is worth $2 million in billing over the next 3 years. The Colorado Tourism Board account is worth even more." I pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of Morrison, Chen and Associates. "Patricia Romano has been very thorough in documenting your intellectual property theft. We have evidence of 8 major campaigns that you've stolen from me, representing approximately $12 million in business that Hayes and Associates secured through fraudulent means." $12 million, Robert repeated faintly. It was the first time he'd spoken all evening. "The legal term is corporate espionage," I continued, enjoying the way Marcus flinched at each word. "Theft of trade secrets, copyright infringement, fraud. Patricia estimates that the damages, including punitive awards, could easily reach $15 to $20 million. Helen had gone completely white. "Victoria, surely we can discuss this privately. There's no need for legal action between family members." "Family members?" I looked around the table at these people who'd never truly accepted me, who'd tolerated my presence while treating me as an outsider for 8 years. "Helen, your son brought his pregnant mistress to Christmas dinner to announce their engagement. I think we're well beyond family courtesy at this point." Marcus finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse. "What do you want?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when the power dynamic shifted completely in my favor. For months, I'd been the unknowing victim of his theft and betrayal. Tonight, I was about to become the architect of his destruction. "What I want," I said, reaching into the briefcase again, "is justice." The next document I produced was a termination letter on Hayes & Associates letterhead, though not the kind anyone at the table was expecting. "This is Amber's termination. Notice," I announced, sliding the paper across the table to the pregnant young woman who'd been staring at me with growing horror, effective immediately, for cause. "You can't fire me," Amber stammered. "You don't work at Hayes & Associates." "Actually," I smiled, producing another document, "as of this afternoon, I do. I'm the new majority owner." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck, while the rest of the family sat frozen in shock. "You see?" I continued, my voice taking on the presentation tone I used for my most important pitches. "When Patricia began investigating Marcus's theft of my intellectual property, we discovered some very interesting things about Hayes & Associates' financial structure. Did you know, Marcus, that your business loan from First National Bank includes a clause about fraudulent practices voiding the loan terms?" Marcus's face had gone from white to green. "Victoria, you don't understand what you're doing. If you destroy the business, you'll destroy yourself too." "On the contrary, I understand exactly what I'm doing. When First National learned about the intellectual property theft, they had two choices: call in the loan immediately, which would have bankrupted Hayes & Associates, or accept my offer to assume the debt in exchange for controlling interest in the company." I pulled out the final document in my presentation, a stock transfer agreement bearing today's date. "Congratulations, Marcus. You're now a minority partner in your own family business. And as the new majority owner, my first executive decision was to terminate Amber Sullivan for violation of company policies regarding workplace relationships." Amber was crying now, soft sobs that she was trying to muffle with her napkin. Marcus looked like he was in physical pain, staring at the documents that represented the complete dissolution of everything he'd built. "This is insane," Diane whispered. "You can't just steal someone's business." "I'm not stealing anything," I replied calmly. "I'm taking legal possession of assets that were built using my stolen work. Every client that Marcus secured through my campaigns, every contract he won with my strategies, every dollar of revenue generated by my ideas, all of it was essentially stolen property. Now it's simply being returned to its rightful owner." Helen was gripping her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "What about the baby? What about Amber's future?" "What about it?" I asked, genuinely curious about her sudden concern for the woman who'd been having an affair with her married son. "Amber made her choices. She chose to sleep with her married boss. She chose to get pregnant by a man who was stealing from his wife. She chose to come to Christmas dinner to celebrate destroying another woman's marriage. These are the consequences of those choices." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "You planned this whole thing. The dinner, having my family here, all of it." "Actually, no. You planned the dinner, Marcus. You chose to bring your pregnant mistress to our home. You decided to make your grand announcement in front of your family. I simply prepared for multiple contingencies, like any good strategist would." I stood up, smoothing my red dress with the same casual confidence I'd use after delivering a successful presentation. "Now, since Amber is no longer employed by Hayes & Associates and is therefore trespassing on company property, because yes, this house is owned by the company as a business asset, I'm going to have to ask her to leave." You can't throw a pregnant woman out in the snow, Helen protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I'm not throwing anyone out. I'm simply requesting that a terminated employee remove herself from company premises. Marcus is welcome to leave with her, of course. In fact, I encourage it. But he should understand that as of tomorrow morning, Hayes and Associates will be operating under new management. Marcus stood slowly, like an old man despite being only 36 years old. Victoria, please. We can work something out. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't destroy everything. Everything was destroyed the moment you decided to betray me, I replied. I'm simply cleaning up the wreckage and building something better from what remains. Amber was gathering her purse with shaking hands, her face streaked with tears. She looked young and vulnerable and completely out of her depth, which she was. Whatever fantasies she'd entertained about becoming Mrs. Marcus Hayes and living happily ever after had just been shattered as thoroughly as my own marriage had been. Come on, Amber, Marcus said quietly, helping her to her feet. We should go. Where? She asked, and the desperation in her voice was heartbreaking despite everything she'd done. Where are we supposed to go? It was a good question. Marcus's entire lifestyle had been built on the success of Hayes and Associates. The expensive car, the designer clothes, the upscale apartment he'd been renting for their trysts, it depended on a business that no longer belonged to him. That's not my problem to solve, I said, and I meant it. You're both adults. You made adult decisions. Now you get to live with adult consequences. As they gathered their coats, Helen made one last attempt at damage control. Victoria, think about what you're doing. Is revenge really worth destroying so many lives? I considered her question seriously, looking around the dining room where I'd hosted countless family gatherings, where I'd played the perfect wife for 8 years while my husband stole my work and cheated on me with his secretary. Helen, this isn't revenge. Revenge would be emotional, impulsive, destructive for its own sake. This is justice. This is accountability. This is a woman taking back what was stolen from her and ensuring it can't happen again. I walked them to the door, maintaining perfect hostess composure even as I escorted my husband and his pregnant mistress out of the home we'd shared. The snow was falling more heavily now, creating a winter wonderland that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Goodbye, Marcus, I said as they stepped onto the porch. I'll have Patricia send you the divorce papers after the holidays, along with the lawsuit for intellectual property theft, of course. He paused at the bottom of the steps, turning back to look at me one last time. In the porch light, with snow gathering on his shoulders, he looked like a broken man. I did. Love you, Victoria. I want you to know that. I know you did, I replied. But you loved yourself more, and that was never going to be enough. After I closed the door, I returned to the dining room where Helen, Diane, and Robert sat in stunned silence. The Christmas dinner I'd spent weeks planning was growing cold on their plates, but none of them seemed to have any appetite. Well, I said, resuming my seat and taking a sip of wine. Who wants dessert? The silence stretched across the dining room like a frozen lake, beautiful and treacherous. Helen stared at her untouched plate while Diane sat rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone trying to maintain control in an uncontrollable situation. Robert had loosened his tie and was studying the wine in his glass as if it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I think I'll pass on dessert, Diane finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. This has been quite enough for one evening. I nodded graciously, as if we'd just concluded a pleasant family dinner instead of witnessing the complete destruction of her brother's life. Of course, though I did make Marcus's favorite chocolate cake. It seems a shame to let it go to waste. The casual mention of the cake, with its implication that I'd been planning this Christmas celebration even while orchestrating Marcus's downfall, sent a visible shiver through Helen. She looked at me with new eyes, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in 8 years of family gatherings. "You knew," she said suddenly. "You knew about the affair when you invited us all here tonight." "I suspected," I corrected, beginning to clear the plates with the same methodical efficiency I brought to everything in my life. I'd been noticing changes in Marcus's behavior for months. The late nights, the new cologne, the sudden interest in fitness. And then there was Amber's perfume on his shirts, which I initially explained away as elevator encounters or crowded restaurants. Diane was watching me with fascination and horror. "When did you find out for certain?" I paused in my clearing, remembering the moment 3 weeks ago when everything had crystallized. Marcus left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. A text came in from someone named A with a heart emoji. "Can't wait to tell everyone about the baby. I love you." I opened his messages and found months of conversations that left very little to the imagination. "And you said nothing?" Robert asked, speaking for the second time that evening. What would have been the point? Confronting him privately would have given him time to prepare his defense, to hide assets, to coordinate his story with Amber. I needed time to investigate, to plan, to ensure that when the truth came out, I would be in a position of strength rather than vulnerability. I continued clearing the table, the domestic routine providing a strange counterpoint to the extraordinary circumstances. Helen and Diane exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing realization that they had severely underestimated me for nearly a decade. "The business investigation," Helen said slowly. "How long have you been planning that?" "The intellectual property theft wasn't part of any grand plan," I admitted, carrying dishes to the kitchen. "I discovered that purely by accident about 2 months ago. I was reviewing some of my old campaign files for a new project when I recognized elements that Marcus had presented as his own work. Once I started looking systematically, the pattern became impossible to ignore. When I returned from the kitchen, I found the 3 remaining family members huddled together in whispered conversation. They fell silent as I approached, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know about the nature of their discussion. "You're wondering how much damage this will do to the Hayes family reputation," I said, settling back into my chair. "You're calculating whether there's any way to contain the scandal, to minimize the fallout." Diane's cheeks flushed, confirming my assessment. "Can you blame us? This affects more than just Marcus and you. There are employees, clients, community relationships, all built on stolen work," I interrupted gently. "Diane, I understand your concern for the family name, but let's be clear about what's actually happened here. Marcus systematically stole my intellectual property for over a year. He used my stolen ideas to secure millions of dollars in contracts. He built his reputation as an innovative marketer on work that he didn't create. And he did all of this while conducting an affair with his secretary that resulted in a pregnancy." I reached for my wine glass, noting that my hands remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what I'd just accomplished. "The damage to the Hayes family reputation isn't something I'm inflicting. It's something Marcus created through his own choices. I'm simply ensuring that the truth comes to light." Helen's composure finally cracked. "What happens now? To the business, to the employees, to everything James built?" Her voice carried the weight of a woman watching her late husband's legacy crumble. The question of Marcus's father was one I'd anticipated. James Hayes had been a decent man who'd built Hayes & Associates through honest work and genuine innovation. His death 3 years ago had been devastating for the entire family, and Marcus's inheritance of the business had seemed like a natural continuation of his father's vision. "James's legacy isn't the problem here," I said softly. "Your late husband built something genuine and valuable. Marcus corrupted it by turning it into a vehicle for theft and deception. What I'm doing is returning the company to the ethical standards that James would have demanded." "By destroying it?" Diane challenged. "By cleaning house?" I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden where Marcus and I had hosted summer barbecues for his colleagues and clients. Tomorrow morning, I'll be meeting with all of Hayes & Associates employees to explain the situation. Those who were complicit in Marcus's theft will be terminated. Those who were simply doing their jobs honestly will be offered positions in the restructured company. I turned back to face them, noting how small and defeated they looked in their dining room chairs. The clients who were served well by the company's work will retain their contracts, though they'll be informed about the ownership change. The contracts that were secured through stolen proposals will be renegotiated under honest terms or dissolved entirely. And Marcus? Helen asked quietly. It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. For 8 years, Marcus had been my husband, my partner, the person I'd trusted above all others. Despite his betrayal, despite the systematic way he'd stolen from me and lied to me, some part of me still remembered the man I'd fallen in love with. Marcus will face the legal consequences of his actions, I said simply. Patricia has prepared a comprehensive lawsuit that will likely result in significant financial damages. Whether he faces criminal charges for corporate espionage will depend on how thoroughly the district attorney's office chooses to investigate. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Corporate espionage was a federal crime, carrying potential prison time in addition to financial penalties. Prison? Robert whispered. It's possible, I confirmed. The systematic nature of the theft, the monetary value involved, the fact that he used stolen work to secure fraudulent contracts, all of that could easily rise to the level of criminal prosecution. Diane was shaking her head in disbelief. This is insane. A few months ago, everything was fine. Marcus was successful, you seemed happy, the family was intact. How did it all fall apart so quickly? Nothing fell apart quickly, I corrected. This has been building for over a year. Marcus's theft, his affair, his complete disregard for our marriage vows and business ethics, all of that was happening gradually, steadily, while I remained oblivious. What happened quickly was my response once I finally understood the scope of his betrayal. I moved to the sideboard and poured myself another glass of wine, offering the bottle to the others. Only Robert accepted, perhaps needing liquid courage for whatever was coming next. The truth is, I continued, I spent 8 years trying to fit into this family, trying to earn respect and acceptance from people who saw me as an outsider. I subsumed my own ambitions, downplayed my own achievements, made myself smaller so that Marcus could appear larger. And the whole time, he was literally stealing my work to build his reputation. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Victoria, if we made you feel unwelcome— You didn't make me feel unwelcome, I interrupted. You made me unwelcome. There's a difference. Every family gathering where my career was dismissed as a little job. Every conversation where my opinions were ignored or corrected. Every achievement of mine that was minimized while Marcus's successes were celebrated. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity. Helen's constant suggestions that I should consider working part-time so I could focus more on supporting Marcus's career. Diane's surprise whenever I demonstrated knowledge about business or marketing, as if intelligence were incompatible with my role as Marcus's wife. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room, then resume without including me. I thought I was being patient, I continued. I thought eventually you'd see me as more than just an accessory to Marcus's life. But tonight, watching him bring his pregnant mistress to Christmas dinner as if I were simply an obstacle to be managed, I realized that patience had been my greatest mistake. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 o'clock, marking the passage of time that felt both eternal and instantaneous. 4 hours ago, I'd been preparing for a family Christmas celebration. Now I was the majority owner of Hayes & Associates, and my marriage was effectively over. What about forgiveness? Helen asked suddenly. What about second chances? Marriage is supposed to be about working through difficulties together. I looked at this woman who'd never truly accepted me as part of her family, now pleading for mercy for the son who'd betrayed me in every way possible. Helen, Marcus didn't make a mistake. He didn't have a momentary lapse in judgment. He spent over a year systematically stealing from me while conducting an affair that resulted in a pregnancy. He brought his pregnant mistress to our home to announce their engagement. These aren't difficulties to work through. These are fundamental character flaws that make him unsuitable as a husband and business partner. But surely, Diane began. There is no surely. I cut her off firmly. Marcus made his choices. He chose to steal my work. He chose to have an affair. He chose to get Amber pregnant. He chose to humiliate me in my own home. I'm simply responding to those choices with appropriate consequences. The phone rang in the kitchen, startling all of us. I excused myself to answer it, grateful for the brief respite from the family's attempts to negotiate on Marcus's behalf. Victoria? The voice was unfamiliar, female, nervous. This is Amber. Please don't hang up. I leaned against the kitchen counter, considering whether to end the call immediately. Curiosity won out over irritation. What do you want, Amber? I need to talk to you about Marcus, about the business, about everything. There are things you need to know. Her voice carried a desperate edge that made me pay attention despite my inclination to dismiss anything she might say. What kind of things? Not over the phone. Can we meet? Tomorrow, maybe? I know you have no reason to trust me, but I think I can help you understand what really happened. I glanced toward the dining room where Marcus's family was probably planning their next move in what they undoubtedly saw as damage control mode. Why would you want to help me? A long pause. Because I'm starting to realize that Marcus lied to me about a lot more than just his marriage. The vulnerability in her voice was either genuine or expertly performed. Either way, she'd succeeded in piquing my interest. I'll consider it, I said finally. Call me tomorrow afternoon. After hanging up, I returned to the dining room to find the Hayes family in animated whispered discussion that ceased abruptly upon my return. Everything all right? Diane asked with forced casualness. Fine, just a business call. I settled back into my chair, noting how they were all watching me with the wariness of people who'd learned not to underestimate their opponent. Victoria, Helen began carefully, we've been talking, and we think there might be a way to resolve this situation that benefits everyone. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious about what they might propose. What did you have in mind? Robert cleared his throat, apparently designated as the family spokesperson. What if Marcus stepped down from the business voluntarily? A quiet resignation, citing personal reasons. You could maintain ownership but avoid the public scandal of a lawsuit. He'd get help for his problems, make amends privately, and everyone could move forward with dignity intact. It was a reasonable proposal, from their perspective, offering face-saving measures for all parties involved. The old Victoria, the one who'd spent 8 years trying to maintain family harmony, might have considered it seriously. And the intellectual property theft? I asked. Marcus could provide public acknowledgement of your contributions to the campaigns in question, Diane suggested. A press release crediting you with collaborative work on the projects. Collaborative work. I repeated the phrase slowly, tasting its inadequacy. So, instead of admitting that he stole my ideas wholesale, he'd suggest we work together. As equals? It would protect both your reputations, Helen pointed out. My reputation doesn't need protecting. I didn't steal anything or cheat on anyone or bring my pregnant lover to a family dinner. The harshness of my response seemed to surprise them, as if they'd expected gratitude for their generous offer to help me minimize the consequences of Marcus's actions. And the affair? I continued. How do you propose we handle that discreetly? Amber is 6 months pregnant with his child. She's planning to marry him. Exactly how do you envision that remaining private? None of them had an answer for that, because there wasn't one. Marcus's betrayal had been too public, too blatant, too complete to be quietly managed away. The offer is appreciated, I said, finally. But I'm not interested in protecting Marcus from the consequences of his choices. He's going to face the full legal and professional ramifications of what he's done. Even if it destroys him completely? Helen asked, her voice breaking. Slightly. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the man I'd married 8 years ago, the promising young businessman who'd charmed me with his ambition and charisma. Helen, Marcus destroyed himself. I'm simply refusing to help him hide the wreckage. The finality in my voice seemed to settle over them like falling snow, cold and inescapable. They'd made their attempt at negotiation and found me unmoved by appeals to family loyalty or concerns about reputation. I think we should go, Diane said quietly, rising from her chair. This has been enough trauma for one evening. As they gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Helen paused at the front door. Victoria, I want you to know that despite everything, James would have been proud of how you've handled yourself tonight. You showed more strength and intelligence than any of us gave you credit for. It was perhaps the first genuine compliment Helen had ever given me, and it came only after I'd demonstrated the power to destroy her son's life. Thank you, I replied simply. I wish the circumstances had been different. After they left, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to have been a perfect Christmas celebration. The tree lights twinkled, cheerfully, oblivious to the domestic devastation that had unfolded around them. The carefully arranged place settings sat abandoned, the expensive wine growing warm in forgotten glasses. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Legal proceedings, business restructuring, media management, the countless details involved in rebuilding a life and a company from the ground up. Tonight, though, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. For the first time in 8 years, I was completely, authentically myself. No longer Marcus's supportive wife, no longer the family outsider seeking acceptance, no longer the woman who made herself smaller to accommodate others' comfort. I was Victoria Hayes, and I was finally free. The morning after Christmas brought an unexpected clarity, like the way air feels sharp and clean after a storm. I woke in my own bed for what I suspected might be the last time in this house, watching sunlight stream through windows that no longer felt like home. The events of the previous evening seemed almost surreal in the gentle morning light, but the stack of legal documents on my nightstand served as tangible proof that my life had fundamentally changed. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn with missed calls and text messages, most from numbers I didn't recognize. Word traveled fast in Denver's business community, especially when it involved scandal at one of the city's most prominent marketing firms. I scrolled through the messages while making coffee, noting the mix of support, curiosity, and barely concealed gossip-seeking that characterized professional networks during times of crisis. Caroline West had sent 3 increasingly urgent messages asking if I was all right and demanding details. Several colleagues from Morrison and Lang expressed shock and offered assistance. There were even messages from competitors, some offering condolences and others clearly fishing for information about potential client defections from Hayes & Associates. But it was the call from Patricia Romano at 8:30 that truly launched my new reality into motion. Victoria, I hope you got some sleep because today is going to be intense, she said without preamble. The story broke in the Denver Business Journal this morning, and every media outlet in the city is calling for comment. I felt a chill run down my spine. What story? I didn't talk to any reporters. Someone else did. The headline reads, Christmas Coup. Marketing Executive Exposes Husband's Corporate Theft. They have details about the intellectual property lawsuit, the business takeover, even quotes about the Christmas dinner confrontation. The coffee mug slipped slightly in my hands as I processed this information. How could they possibly know about the dinner? The only people there were family members. That's a very good question, Patricia replied grimly. The article cites sources close to the Hayes family and includes specifics that could only have come from someone who was present. Either someone at that dinner talked to reporters, or there's another leak we don't know about. I sank into a kitchen chair, my mind racing through possibilities. Helen, Diane, and Robert had left shaken but not vindictive. Marcus and Amber had their own reasons to avoid publicity, unless someone was desperate enough to try controlling the narrative by getting their version of events out first. What exactly did the article say? It's actually fairly sympathetic to you, Patricia admitted. It portrays you as a brilliant marketing professional who discovered her husband was stealing her work and having an affair. The focus is on your strategic response rather than the personal betrayal. But Victoria, this changes everything about how we handle the next few days. She was right, of course. My plan had been to control the disclosure of information carefully, managing the business transition and legal proceedings with minimal public attention. Now that the story was public, I'd be forced to respond to media scrutiny while simultaneously dealing with the complex logistics of reorganizing Hayes and Associates. There's more, Patricia continued. I've had calls from 3 other marketing professionals in the past hour, all claiming that Marcus presented their work as his own at various industry conferences. This pattern of theft might be more extensive than we initially realized. The wow. Implications of that revelation hit me like a physical blow. If Marcus had been stealing from multiple sources, not just me, then Hayes and Associates' success had been built on an even more elaborate foundation of fraud than I'd suspected. How many others? I asked. Too early to tell, but I expect more to come forward once this becomes widely known. People who suspected something but didn't have proof, or who thought they were isolated incidents. I walked to my home office and began pulling files, suddenly understanding that the scope of Marcus's deception might dwarf even my worst assumptions. Patricia, I need you to set up a meeting with the Hayes and Associates staff for this afternoon. If we're going to rebuild this company ethically, we need to know exactly what we're working with. Already scheduled for 2 o'clock. I also took the liberty of hiring a public relations firm to help manage media inquiries. Victoria, you're about to become a very public figure, whether you want to be or not. After ending the call, I spent an hour reviewing the Denver Business Journal article online. The reporter had clearly done their homework, providing background on both my career accomplishments and Marcus's recent business successes. The contrast was illuminating when viewed through the lens of intellectual property theft. The article mentioned my award-winning campaigns for Morrison & Lang, my reputation for innovative strategies, and my graduate work in behavioral marketing. Then it detailed Hayes and Associates' sudden surge in high-profile clients over the past year, coinciding almost exactly with when Marcus had begun stealing my work. What struck me most was how obvious the pattern seemed when laid out chronologically. Marcus's breakthrough ideas had appeared with suspicious regularity after my major projects, sometimes within weeks of completion. Any competent investigator should have been able to spot the correlation. The phone rang again, interrupting my analysis. This time it was an unknown number, but given the circumstances, I decided to answer. Mrs. Hayes? This is Jennifer Morgan from Channel 7 News. I was hoping to get your comment on the Hayes and Associates situation. I'd been expecting this call, but hearing it still made my stomach tighten. I'm not prepared to make any public statements at this time. Just a few questions about your husband's alleged theft of your marketing campaigns. Our viewers would be very interested in hearing your side of the story. Any statements I make will be through my attorney. Thank you. I hung up quickly, but the phone rang again almost immediately. Another reporter, this time from the Denver Post. Then a radio station, followed by what sounded like a freelance journalist working on a longer feature story. By 10 o'clock, I'd stopped answering unknown numbers entirely. The persistent ringing created an odd soundtrack to my morning as I prepared for what was likely to be the most challenging day of my professional life. The doorbell rang just after 11, sending a spike of anxiety through me. Through the peephole, I was surprised to see Amber Sullivan standing on my porch, looking pale and exhausted in yesterday's clothes. I opened the door cautiously, noting how young and vulnerable she appeared in the bright morning light. The confident woman who'd walked into my Christmas dinner had been replaced by someone who looked lost and frightened. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said quietly. "I didn't agree to see you. You showed up uninvited, just like yesterday." She flinched at the harshness in my tone but didn't retreat. "Please, Mrs. Hayes, 5 minutes. There are things about Marcus that you need to know." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let her enter. She moved carefully, one hand supporting her back in the way pregnant women do when they're carrying extra weight. "You look terrible," I observed, leading her to the living room. "Where did you spend the night?" "A hotel. Marcus was too upset to think clearly, and I needed time to process everything that happened." She settled gingerly onto the sofa, the same spot where she'd sat so confidently the evening before. "And what conclusions did you reach during this processing?" Amber took a shaky breath before meeting my eyes. "I think Marcus has been lying to me about a lot more than just your marriage." This was what she'd hinted at during her phone call, but I was still skeptical about her motives for being here. "What kind of lies?" "He told me you two had been separated for months, living like roommates while you worked out divorce details. He said you knew about us and were okay with it because you'd both moved on emotionally." I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity of it. "And you believed that?" "I wanted to believe it," she admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Marcus can be very convincing when he wants something. He made me feel like I was saving him from an unhappy marriage, not destroying a happy one. Even if that were true, which it wasn't. You still chose to sleep with your married boss. You still chose to get pregnant by him. You still chose to participate in whatever fantasy he was selling you." She nodded miserably. "I know. I made terrible choices, and I'm going to have to live with the consequences. But Mrs. Hayes, there's something else. Something about the business that I think you should know." I waited, curious despite my anger. "Marcus has been doing more than stealing your ideas. He's been manipulating client contracts, inflating billing hours, charging for services that were never provided. The regional retail group account alone has fraudulent charges totaling over $300,000. The revelation hit me like cold water. If what Amber was saying was true, then Marcus's crimes extended far beyond intellectual property, theft into outright embezzlement and fraud. "How do you know this?" "I process all the billing statements. I've been uncomfortable with some of the charges for months, but Marcus always had explanations. Emergency consultations, rush fees, premium service charges. It all sounded plausible until I started paying closer attention to the actual work being done." She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. "I copied everything before I left the office yesterday. Client files, billing records, email correspondences. I thought I was protecting Marcus by documenting his success, but now I realize I was actually creating evidence of his crimes." I stared at the small device that potentially contained proof of financial fraud, extensive enough to bring criminal charges that would make my intellectual property lawsuit look minor by comparison. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I'm 26 years old and 6 months pregnant, and I'm starting to understand that I've been living in a fantasy created by a man who's been lying to everyone around him for years." Her voice broke slightly. "Because yesterday, when you revealed the intellectual property theft, I realized that Marcus is capable of deceiving people who trust him completely, including me." I took the flash drive, feeling its weight both physical and metaphorical. What do you expect in return? Nothing. I don't expect anything. I just thought you deserved to know the full extent of what you're dealing with. She stood slowly, preparing to leave. And Mrs. Hayes? I am truly sorry. For the affair, for the pregnancy, for showing up at your Christmas dinner. I was young and stupid and selfish, but I'm not malicious. I never wanted to hurt you. After she left, I sat staring at the flash drive for a long time. Amber's revelation had the potential to transform my civil lawsuit into a criminal investigation that could send Marcus to federal prison. The thought should have been satisfying, but instead I felt a strange hollowness. When I'd married Marcus 8 years ago, I'd believed I was joining my life to someone with integrity and ambition. The gradual erosion of our relationship had been painful, but I'd attributed it to the natural challenges of building careers and maintaining a marriage. I'd never imagined that the man I'd trusted completely was capable of systematic fraud, theft, and deception on such a massive scale. The phone rang again, pulling me from my thoughts. This time it was Caroline, calling from her office at Morrison & Lang. Victoria, please tell me you're okay. The entire marketing community is buzzing about this story, and everyone's asking if I knew what was happening. I'm managing, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Caroline, I need to ask you something confidential. Have you ever suspected that Marcus was using ideas that didn't originate with him? A long pause. Why do you ask? Because other people are coming forward with similar claims, and I'm trying to understand how extensive this pattern might be. Honestly? Yes. There were a couple of times when his campaign concept seemed remarkably similar to work I'd seen elsewhere. But Victoria, that happens in our industry. Similar solutions to similar problems, parallel thinking, industry trends. I never suspected outright theft. What if I told you it was outright theft? What if I told you he'd been systematically stealing not just from me, but from multiple sources? Another pause, longer this time. Then I'd say you're looking at something much bigger than a marital dispute. You're looking at career fraud that could affect every contract he's signed, every client relationship he's built, every professional reputation associated with Hayes & Associates. The full magnitude of the situation was beginning to crystallize. This wasn't just about my stolen work or even Marcus's affair. This was about a company built on systematic deception, fraud that had infected every aspect of its operations. By the time I arrived at the Hayes & Associates offices that afternoon, a small crowd of reporters had gathered outside the building. I parked in the rear garage and entered through the service elevator, avoiding the media attention that was already becoming oppressive. The conference room was packed with employees, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, anxiety, and curiosity. Some I recognized from company parties and professional events. Others were strangers whose jobs I was now responsible for protecting or eliminating. Patricia Romano stood at the front of the room with a stack of documents and a grim expression. As I took my place beside her, I could feel the weight of 37 pairs of eyes examining me with the intensity of people whose livelihoods hung in the balance. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I'm sure you all have questions about recent developments at Hayes & Associates. I'm here to provide answers and to discuss the future of this company." A hand shot up immediately. David Chen, one of the senior account managers, looked like he hadn't slept since the story broke. "Is it true that you now own a controlling interest in the company?" "Yes. As of yesterday, I hold a 67% stake in Hayes & Associates, acquired through assumption of the company's primary business loan." "What about Marcus?" The question came from Sarah Patel, a creative director who'd worked closely with him on several major campaigns. "Marcus Hayes is no longer employed by this company. He was terminated yesterday for cause, related to violations of intellectual property laws and ethical business practices. The room erupted in whispered conversations as people processed this information. I waited for quiet before continuing. I understand this is shocking and unsettling. Many of you have worked here for years, building relationships with clients and developing campaigns you're proud of. I want to assure you that my goal is not to destroy what James Hayes built, but to restore it to the ethical standards he would have demanded. Are we all going to lose our jobs? The question came from Tom Rodriguez in accounting, and I could hear the fear in his voice. Not if you've been doing honest work. However, I need to be transparent about the situation we're facing. Evidence has emerged suggesting that some of Hayes and Associates' recent success was built on stolen intellectual property and potentially fraudulent billing practices. We need to conduct a thorough review of all client relationships and project work over the past 2 years. I looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as possible. Those of you who were simply doing your jobs honestly have nothing to fear. Those who were complicit in or aware of fraudulent practices will be terminated and may face legal consequences. And those who were unknowingly working on projects built on stolen ideas will have the opportunity to help us make things right with affected clients. Patricia stepped forward with her legal documents. We'll be conducting individual interviews with all staff members over the next week. These will be confidential conversations designed to understand your role in various projects and identify any concerns you may have about past work. What about our clients? Asked Jennifer Walsh from the Public Relations Department. Are they going to drop us once this becomes widely known? It was the question I'd been dreading, because the honest answer was deeply uncertain. Some clients will likely terminate their contracts, especially those who feel deceived about the originality of work they've paid for. Others may choose to stay if we can demonstrate our commitment to ethical practices going forward. And some may actually respect our decision to address these problems head-on, rather than cover them up. Are you planning to rename the company? David asked. I considered the question carefully. The Hayes name carried decades of reputation, both positive and now negative. That decision hasn't been made yet. It will depend partly on how extensive the fraudulent work proves to be, and partly on whether we can rebuild trust while maintaining the Hayes legacy. The meeting continued for another hour, with questions ranging from practical concerns about payroll and benefits to broader inquiries about the company's future direction. Throughout it all, I found myself studying the faces of these people whose lives had been upended by Marcus's choices. Some, like David and Jennifer, seemed genuinely shocked by the allegations and eager to distance themselves from any wrongdoing. Others appeared more guarded, as if they knew more than they were willing to admit in a public setting. A few looked relieved, suggesting they'd suspected problems but hadn't known how to address them. As the meeting concluded and employees filed out in small groups, I remained behind with Patricia to review our next steps. How do you think that went? I asked. Better than expected. No one walked out, no one made threats, and several people approached me afterward to schedule their individual interviews as soon as possible. Those are good signs. And the bad signs? There were at least 3 people in that room who looked terrified when you mentioned fraudulent billing practices. My guess is they know exactly what Amber was talking about and are trying to figure out how to minimize their exposure. I nodded, having noticed the same reactions. The real work of rebuilding Hayes and Associates was just beginning, and it would require dismantling everything Marcus had corrupted while preserving whatever remained of his father's legitimate legacy. As we prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, the message made my blood run cold. This is just the beginning. You have no idea what you've started. Some secrets are better left buried. I showed the message to Patricia, who immediately became alert and protective. Do you recognize the number? No, but the timing isn't coincidental. Someone doesn't want me digging deeper into Hayes and Associates operations. We need to take this seriously, Victoria. If there are financial crimes involved, there could be other parties with significant interests in keeping this quiet. As we left the building through the back entrance, avoiding the reporters who were still gathered out front, I realized that my Christmas dinner revelation had been just the opening move in what was becoming a much larger and more dangerous game. Someone had leaked the story to control the narrative. Someone had sent me a threatening text to discourage further investigation. And somewhere out there, Marcus was dealing with the complete collapse of everything he'd built on lies and theft. The war for the truth was just beginning. 3 weeks into the new year, I stood in the renovated conference room of what was now officially Matthews Marketing Solutions, watching Denver's skyline through windows that had been thoroughly cleaned of the past. The nameplate on the building had been changed the previous Friday, marking the complete transformation from Hayes and Associates to something entirely new and honest. The investigation that had begun with Amber's flash drive had uncovered fraud so extensive that federal agencies were now involved. Marcus wasn't just guilty of intellectual property theft and embezzlement, he'd been operating what amounted to a sophisticated marketing Ponzi scheme, using stolen ideas and inflated billing to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle while building a reputation on completely fabricated success. Patricia Romano entered the conference room with a stack of documents and a satisfied expression that had become familiar over the past month. "The final settlement agreements came through this morning," she announced, settling into a chair across from me. "Regional Retail Group accepted our offer of full restitution plus damages. Colorado Tourism Board wants to continue their contract under the new terms. And Morrison & Lang has agreed to a partnership arrangement that could be very lucrative for both firms." I nodded, reviewing the financial projections spread across the mahogany table that had once hosted Marcus's stolen presentations. Matthews Marketing Solutions was not only surviving the transition, it was thriving in ways that Hayes and Associates never had when built on deception. What about the criminal proceedings? Marcus pled guilty to federal fraud charges yesterday. He'll serve 18 months in minimum security and pay restitution of $3 million. The plea deal also requires him to publicly acknowledge the intellectual property theft and cooperate with any additional investigations. The news should have felt like vindication, but instead I experienced a complex mixture of relief and sadness. The man I'd married 8 years ago was going to prison, his reputation destroyed, his future uncertain. Despite everything he'd done, some part of me mourned the waste of potential and the complete destruction of what had once seemed like love. "Any word on the other victims who came forward?" Patricia consulted her notes. 7 additional marketing professionals have filed lawsuits with evidence of intellectual property theft. The total damages Marcus is facing now exceed $5 million. He'll likely spend the rest of his career paying restitution. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline West, who had become not just a friend but a business partner in the new venture. The message was brief but significant. "Denver Marketing Association wants to nominate you for Executive of the Year. Interested?" 6 months ago, I would have been thrilled by such recognition. Now, having built something genuine, from the ashes of Marcus's deceptions, I found myself more interested in the work itself than the accolades. "There's something else," Patricia continued, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Amber Sullivan had her baby last week, a daughter. She's asked if she could meet with you." The request surprised me. Since providing the evidence that had expanded the criminal investigation, Amber had maintained careful distance from the legal proceedings. I'd heard through various channels that she'd moved back to live with her parents in Colorado Springs, working part-time for a small nonprofit, while preparing for motherhood. Did she say what she wants? Just that she has something to tell you that she thinks you'd want to hear, and she wants to thank you. I considered the request while gazing out at the city where I'd rebuilt my professional life from scratch. Amber Sullivan had been the catalyst for exposing Marcus's betrayal, but she'd also been complicit in it. Her motivations for reaching out now were unclear, but my curiosity outweighed my lingering resentment. Schedule something for next week, somewhere neutral. The rest of the afternoon was spent reviewing client proposals for the coming quarter. Matthew's Marketing Solutions had attracted an impressive roster of businesses seeking ethical partnerships. After the Hayes & Associates scandal had raised industry awareness about fraudulent practices, companies wanted to work with a firm that had proven its commitment to honesty, even at great personal cost. At 5 o'clock, I was preparing to leave when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. Helen Hayes stood in the reception area, looking every bit as regal as she had at Christmas dinner, but with something different in her bearing. The rigid disapproval had been replaced by something that might have been respect. "Victoria, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I was hoping we could speak privately." I led her to my office, noting how she examined the space with interest. The walls displayed awards I'd won for campaigns I'd actually created, photos from client events where I was recognized for my own work, and framed articles about the transformation of the company. "You've done remarkable things here," Helen said, settling into a client chair. "James would have been proud of how you've honored his legacy while cleaning up Marcus's mess." It was perhaps the most generous thing she'd ever said to me, and I found myself genuinely moved by the acknowledgement. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "I came to apologize," she continued, her voice carrying uncharacteristic vulnerability. "For 8 years, I treated you as an outsider, someone who wasn't quite good enough for our family. I was protecting Marcus, enabling his worst qualities while dismissing your achievements. I see now that you were the best thing that ever happened to him, and we all failed to appreciate that." The apology was unexpected and deeply affecting. For so long, I'd struggled to earn acceptance from this woman who represented everything I thought I wanted from marriage and family connection. "Helen, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Marcus called me from prison yesterday. He's finally taking responsibility for what he did, not just the crimes, but the way he treated you. He asked me to tell you that destroying your marriage was his greatest regret, greater even than the damage to his career or reputation." I absorbed this information quietly, trying to reconcile the remorseful man Helen described with the confident deceiver who'd brought his pregnant mistress to Christmas dinner. "He also asked me to give you this." Helen withdrew a small wrapped package from her purse, setting it carefully on my desk. I recognized the wrapping paper immediately. It was the same pattern I'd used for Christmas gifts I'd never had the chance to give. Inside was a simple jewelry box containing a pair of diamond earrings I'd admired months ago during a shopping trip with Marcus. The accompanying note was written in his familiar handwriting. "For the woman who deserved better than I could give. I'm sorry for everything. M." The gesture was touching and heartbreaking in equal measure. After everything that had happened, after all the lies and betrayal and legal consequences, Marcus had somehow managed one last act of genuine consideration. "Will you visit him?" Helen asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. Part of me wanted closure, wanted to see the man who'd destroyed our marriage face the consequences of his choices. But another part of me recognized that my healing didn't require his presence or his explanations. "I don't think so," I said finally. "Some chapters need to end completely before new ones can begin." Helen nodded with understanding. "Diane wanted me to tell you that you're welcome at family gatherings anytime, not as Marcus's ex-wife, but as someone we respect and care about in your own right." The invitation was sincere and appreciated, but also unnecessary. I'd learned that family wasn't something you earned through enduring poor treatment or accommodating others' comfort. Family was something you built with people who valued and respected you from the beginning. "Thank you, but I think it's better if we all move forward separately," Too much has happened for us to pretend we can just resume normal relationships. After Helen left, I sat in my office as darkness settled over Denver, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 weeks ago, I'd been Victoria Hayes, the overlooked wife of a successful businessman, someone who'd made herself smaller to accommodate others' comfort. Tonight, I was Victoria Matthews, CEO of a thriving marketing firm, a woman who'd rebuilt her life on her own terms. The meeting with Amber Sullivan took place the following Tuesday at a small cafe near the university. She arrived pushing a stroller containing a beautiful baby girl with dark hair and serious eyes. Motherhood had changed her in subtle ways, adding gravity to her demeanor and purpose to her movements. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "I know you didn't have to. What did you want to tell me?" Amber adjusted the baby's blanket before meeting my eyes. "I wanted you to know that providing that evidence was the first honest thing I'd done in months. Marcus had me so confused about what was real and what was manipulation that I'd lost track of my own moral compass." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But more than that, I wanted to thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Watching you handle that Christmas dinner, seeing how you'd prepared for every possibility, understanding that you'd been building a case while Marcus thought he was controlling the situation, it taught me something important about taking responsibility for your own life." I studied this young woman who'd been both victim and perpetrator in the drama that had upended all our lives. "What are you going to do now?" "I'm finishing my business degree through online classes. The nonprofit I work for specializes in helping young women who've made poor choices find their way to better decisions. It turns out I have some relevant experience in that area." There was something admirable about her determination to transform her mistakes into something meaningful. It reminded me of my own journey from victim to victor, though the circumstances were very different. "And the baby's father?" "Marcus signed away his parental rights. He said he didn't want his daughter growing up with a father in prison, and I agreed. She'll know the truth when she's old enough to understand it, but for now, she's just mine." We talked for another hour about recovery, responsibility, and the complex process of rebuilding after catastrophic life changes. Despite everything that had happened between us, I found myself respecting Amber's commitment to honest self-reflection and genuine change. As we prepared to leave, she made one final comment that stayed with me long after we parted. "Victoria, I hope you know that what you did wasn't just about getting justice for yourself. You saved other people from being victims of Marcus's fraud. You probably saved clients from losing money, employees from unknowingly participating in crimes, and other professionals from having their work stolen. Sometimes doing the right thing for yourself is also doing the right thing for everyone else." Her words resonated deeply because they captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. About my own experience, the choice to expose Marcus hadn't been motivated by altruism, but the consequences had reached far beyond my personal situation. Spring arrived in Denver with the kind of fresh optimism that made everything seem possible. Matthews Marketing Solutions had not only stabilized but was expanding, adding staff and taking on larger clients who specifically sought our reputation for ethical practices. The industry recognition was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that I'd built something genuine and sustainable. Caroline West and I were collaborating on a marketing conference focused on professional ethics and intellectual property protection. The scandal that had started with my Christmas dinner revelation had sparked industry-wide conversations about preventing fraud and protecting creative work. "You've become something of a folk hero," Caroline told me over lunch. "People are calling you the woman who took down an entire network of marketing fraud." "That seems like an overstatement," I replied, though I appreciated the recognition. "Is it, though? The investigation that started with Marcus has exposed similar practices at 3 other firms. The industry is implementing new standards for verifying original work. Young professionals are being warned about the signs of intellectual property theft. You started something much bigger than personal justice. She was right, though I'd never intended to become a crusader for marketing ethics. My goals had been much more focused: expose my husband's betrayal, recover my stolen work, and rebuild my professional life. The broader implications had emerged organically from those personal objectives. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my new downtown apartment, looking out at a city where I'd become someone entirely different from the woman who'd opened her door to Marcus and Amber on Christmas Eve. The view was spectacular, encompassing both the urban landscape where I'd built my new career and the mountains that reminded me there were always larger perspectives available. My phone rang with a call from Patricia Romano, who had transitioned from attorney to friend over the months of legal proceedings. "I have news," she said without preamble. "The Justice Department is using the Hayes & Associates case as a model for prosecuting marketing fraud nationwide. They want you to consult on developing protocols for identifying and investigating intellectual property theft in creative industries." The opportunity was both flattering and daunting. Consulting with federal agencies would represent another level of professional recognition, but it would also mean reliving the trauma of Marcus's betrayal repeatedly. "I'll consider it," I replied. "Let me think about whether I'm ready for that kind of public role." "Take your time." "But Victoria, you should know that you've already changed how this industry handles ethical violations. Whether you take on more public work or not, your impact has been permanent." After the call ended, I remained on the balcony as the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere across town, Marcus was beginning his prison sentence, facing the consequences of choices that had seemed clever and profitable until they'd been exposed to scrutiny. Amber was raising their daughter and building a new life based on honest work and genuine values. And I was here, in a space I'd created entirely on my own terms, surrounded by achievements that belonged unquestionably to me. The woman who'd stood in her foyer 6 months ago, watching her husband escort his pregnant mistress into their home, had been someone who accommodated others' comfort at the expense of her own truth. That woman had been generous with forgiveness, patient with disrespect, and willing to make herself smaller to preserve relationships that didn't truly value her. Tonight, I was someone different. Someone who demanded honesty and reciprocity, who built success through genuine achievement rather than stolen credit, who chose justice over comfort and truth over convenience. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. There had been moments of doubt, periods of loneliness, and the constant challenge of rebuilding both personal and professional identity from scratch. But standing here now, looking out at a city full of possibilities I'd created for myself, I knew with absolute certainty that every difficult choice had been worth making. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and for a moment, I tensed, remembering the threatening message from weeks earlier. But this message was different. "Saw your interview in Forbes. Congratulations on everything you've accomplished. You're an inspiration. A fellow survivor." Messages like this had become increasingly common as my story gained national attention. Women who'd faced betrayal, professionals who'd had their work stolen, people who'd discovered that their closest relationships were built on deception, all of them reaching out to say that my example had given them courage to seek their own justice. I hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything, but I was beginning to understand that sometimes personal courage inadvertently becomes public inspiration. As I prepared for bed in my beautiful new apartment, I thought about the Christmas dinner that had changed everything, the carefully planned meal that had become the setting for revelations, confrontations, and the complete restructuring of multiple lives. If I could go back to that moment when the doorbell rang and I saw Marcus standing there with Amber, would I change anything? Would I choose a quieter resolution, a private confrontation, a more graceful accommodation of his betrayal? The answer came immediately and with absolute clarity. I wouldn't change a single moment. That Christmas Eve had been the night Victoria Hayes finally stopped making herself smaller to accommodate others' lies. It had been the night I chose truth over comfort, justice over peace, and authentic success over stolen credit. Most importantly, it had been the night I learned that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge or accommodation. It's becoming so completely, authentically yourself that no one can ever diminish you again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to build something meaningful on the foundation of absolute honesty I'd established. But tonight, for the first time in years, I was exactly who I was meant to be, living precisely the life I deserved. And that was worth every difficult moment it had taken to get here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.